The last thing her son said was, "It's just for a few days." Marge Franklin's voice was too loud in the quiet of the pines, a sound that didn't belong. He didn't meet her eyes when he said it, his gaze fixed on some distant point over her shoulder as he cinched the last knot on the canvas tent. It was a flimsy thing, a summer tent, the kind of shelter a boy might use for playing make-believe. Not the kind a woman of 70 years would call home, even for a night. Beatrice, his wife, stayed in the wagon, her face a pale oval of impatience framed by the dark wood of the wagon seat. She had wrapped a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders, a stark contrast to the threadbare coat they had allowed Matilda to keep. "We just need to clear out your room properly," Franklin continued, his words rushing together. "Get it painted. A proper place for you." He patted her arm, a gesture meant to be reassuring but that felt like a dismissal. Matilda looked from his face to the small pile of their offerings, the thin tent, one wool blanket, a sack with a few potatoes and a side of salted bacon, a tin of coffee. "We gave them everything," she thought, the words a silent, bitter stone in her throat. The farm Thomas had broken his back over for 40 years, the house filled with the ghosts of their children's laughter, the savings stitched into the mattress. All of it signed away on a piece of paper Franklin had said was just a formality. Sundance, her old golden retriever, whined low in his throat, pressing his heavy body against her leg. He understood. Animals always did. He was the only part of her old life they'd let her bring. "The dog will be a nuisance in a clean house," Beatrice had said. But on that, Matilda had not bent. "He stays," was all she had managed, and the finality in her voice had been enough. Franklin gave the dog a wide berth. "He'll keep you company." He finally looked at her then, a quick, darting glance full of a shame he was trying to outrun. "We'll be back before Sunday. Promise." He climbed onto the wagon, not looking back. The crack of the reins was like a gunshot in the still air. Matilda stood perfectly still, her hand resting on Sundance's broad head, and watched the wagon shrink down the dirt track until it was nothing more than a speck, swallowed by the immense, indifferent wilderness. The wind picked up, whispering through the pines, a cold promise of the winter to come. She looked at the pathetic canvas shelter, then at the vast, darkening sky. Sunday. He had promised. The first 2 days were a study in waiting. Matilda moved with the deliberate slowness of a woman who had managed a household and a farm for half a century. She gathered firewood, her joints aching in protest, stacking it neatly near the tent flap. She rationed the food, boiling a single potato each evening in the small pot they had left her, sharing bites with Sundance who watched her with worried, intelligent eyes. The silence was the hardest part. It was a living thing, broken only by the cawing of crows and the ceaseless sighing of the wind. At night, curled under the single blanket with the dog's warm body pressed against her back, she would talk to Thomas, her late husband. "You wouldn't believe this, old man," she'd whisper into the cold dark. "Our Franklin. He was always the softest of the 3-inch." She remembered him as a boy, afraid of the dark, crying when he'd scraped his knee. How had that boy grown into the man who could do this? She tried to hold on to his promise. Sunday. But as the third day bled into the fourth, a cold dread began to seep into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The promise was a lie. She knew it with a certainty that was as solid and sharp as the stones under her thin palate. They had not just brought her here to wait, they had brought her here to be gone. To be forgotten. The bacon was gone by the 5th day. The potatoes were down to 3 small, wrinkled knobs. She spent hours walking the perimeter of the small clearing, her world shrinking to this patch of dirt and pine needles, Sundance trotting faithfully at her heels. She saw the tracks of deer, of rabbits, but she had no means of catching them. Thomas had been the hunter. She had been the one who turned his bounty into a meal, who rendered the fat and stitched the hides. Her hands, now chapped and raw, had once been so capable. They felt useless now. On the 6th evening, she sat by her small, sputtering fire and looked up at the sky. The stars were brilliant, cold chips of ice in an ink-black canvas. There was a halo around the moon. "Snow's coming, Sonny," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. The dog rested his head on her knee, thumping his tail softly against the frozen ground. He licked her hand. I know, his eyes seemed to say. I know. The hope she had clung to, that fragile thread, finally snapped. They were not coming back. Not for her. Not for the dog. They were alone. That was all. The snow began not as a flurry but as a whisper, tiny flakes melting the moment they touched the ground. By nightfall, it was a silent, determined curtain of white, erasing the world. Matilda and Sundance retreated into the tent, the thin canvas providing the barest illusion of shelter. The wind, which had been a constant murmur, rose to a mournful howl, plucking at the tent stakes and making the fabric shudder violently. Cold was no longer just a sensation, it was an entity, a physical presence that pressed in from all sides, seeping through the blanket, through her coat, sinking deep into her marrow. She huddled with Sundance, burying her face in his thick fur, his steady heartbeat a small, warm drum against the roaring chaos outside. The world outside the tent ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the wind and the relentless, soft weight of the snow piling up against the sides of their flimsy refuge. Time dissolved. Day and night became a meaningless cycle of grey light and profound darkness, measured only by the growing ache in her stomach and the deepening chill in her limbs. She melted snow in the small pot over a candle stub until the candle was gone, sipping the lukewarm water to fight the dehydration that made her head swim. She ate the last potato raw, chewing the cold, earthy flesh until her jaw ached. She talked to Thomas constantly now, her voice a low, rambling monologue. She told him about their wedding day, about the birth of Franklin, about the summer they lost the whole wheat crop to blight but somehow survived. The memories kept her anchored, a lifeline thrown back to a world where she was loved, where she belonged. You always said I was stronger than I looked, she murmured to the dog, her words muffled by his fur. I'm trying, Thomas. I am trying. One morning, or what she guessed was a morning, she woke to an unnerving silence. The wind had died. But the light filtering through the canvas was dim, subterranean. She pushed at the tent flap, and it wouldn't budge. A wall of snow had entombed them. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. They were buried. A sob escaped her, a dry, ragged sound. Sundance whined, licking at the tears freezing on her cheeks. She took a deep breath, then another. No. Thomas hadn't raised a woman who gave up. She felt along the canvas wall, pushing, searching for a weak point. The weight of the snow was immense. For a moment, she let her head fall back, the sheer hopelessness of it washing over her. This is it, she thought. This is the end of the story. But then Sundance began to dig, his paws scrabbling with frantic energy at the base of the snow-packed flap. A small trickle of fresh, cold air whispered into their stale tomb. It was enough. A flicker of fight returned. All right, boy, she breathed, joining him, her numb fingers clawing at the packed snow. All right. We dig. His name was Abram. He appeared as if from the snow itself, a tall, weathered figure on snowshoes, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He had been checking his trap lines, a ritual he'd followed for 40 winters, when he saw it, a strange mound of snow with a small, dark opening from which a plume of steam, a living breath, was rising. He'd thought it was a bear den at first. Then he heard the weak, exhausted bark. He moved closer, his face grim. He had seen what this country could do to the unprepared. He knelt, peering into the hole Matilda and Sundance had clawed through the snowdrift. What he saw stopped his heart. A woman's face, pale as porcelain and framed with white hair, her eyes large and dark in their sunken sockets. A golden dog lay beside her, its tail giving a single, hopeful thump. Abram said nothing for a long moment. He simply took in the scene, the flimsy canvas, the single soiled blanket, the woman's trembling hands. He had seen this kind of abandonment before. It left a sickness in his gut. He said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first human voice she had heard in what felt like a lifetime. It sounded like a miracle. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The story was written all over her face. He unslung the pack from his back, his movements economical and sure. He pulled out a thermos and poured a cup of steaming broth. "Drink this." Slow so the warmth spread through her chest, a shocking, painful, beautiful feeling. It was the taste of life. While she drank, he worked, digging away the snow from the tent flap with practiced efficiency. He spoke quietly to the dog, who watched him with an unblinking gaze, too weak to do more than wag his tail. "You're a good boy." You kept her warm when the entrance was clear. Abram looked at Matilda. "Can you walk?" She tried to push herself up, but her legs were useless, numb things that wouldn't obey. She shook her head, a wave of shame washing over her. He just nodded. No matter, he packed her few belongings, the empty pot, the blanket, and then, with a strength that belied his age, he lifted her into his arms. She was shockingly light, a bundle of bones and grit. She closed her eyes, exhausted beyond measure, and rested her head against his rough wool coat. It smelled of pine smoke and winter and safety. He carried her away from the canvas tomb, Sundance stumbling along behind them, and she did not look back. The journey to his cabin was a blur of white snow and grey sky. Matilda drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of Abram's steps and the solid feel of his arms around her. The cabin was small, just one room, but it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. A fire already roared in the stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the log walls. The air was thick with the smell of drying herbs and wood smoke. It smelled like home. Abram laid her gently on a cot near the fire, pulling a thick quilt over her. "Rest now," he said. "You're safe." Sundance collapsed onto the hearthrug, letting out a long sigh that seemed to carry all the fear and hardship of the past weeks. A man arrived not long after, introduced as Dr. Finch. He was younger than Abram, with kind, serious eyes. He examined Matilda with gentle hands, clucking his tongue at the frostbite on her fingers and toes, the gauntness of her frame. "It's a wonder you're alive," he said softly. "You have the constitution of a mule and the spirit of a grizzly." He left salves and tinctures, giving Abram quiet instructions. For the next few days, Matilda did little but sleep. She woke for sips of broth, for Abram to tend to her frostbitten hands, for the doctor's visits. The world came back to her in fragments, the sound of Abram splitting wood outside, the taste of stew, the weight of the quilt, the feeling of Sundance's wet nose nudging her hand. She learned about Abram in pieces. He was a widower. His wife, Sarah, had died 5 years prior. She always used to say, he told Matilda one evening, staring into the fire, that strangers are just family you haven't met yet. He said it simply, a statement of fact, not a performance of his own goodness. That was his way. He acted before he explained. His kindness was a practical thing, demonstrated in the hot meals, the stoked fire, the clean bandages. It was a language Matilda understood better than any words of pity. She began to mend. The color returned to her cheeks, and the strength seeped back into her limbs. The physical healing was straightforward. The other healing, the deeper one, was much slower. The betrayal was a wound that festered inside her. She would wake in the night, the memory of Franklin's face, his false promise, as vivid as the fire in the hearth. How could he? The question echoed in the quiet cabin, a question for which there was no answer. As the weeks turned into a month, a quiet routine settled over the cabin. Matilda was strong enough to sit by the fire, then to walk to the window, then to help Abram with small tasks. She mended his shirts with neat, tiny stitches, her fingers still stiff but slowly regaining their dexterity. She found a deep comfort in the simple, useful work. It was a way of paying back the immense debt she felt she owed him, though he never once made her feel like a burden. The community Abram belonged to began to appear at his door. First came Helen, the pastor's wife, a woman with a warm, round face and hands that were never still. She brought a freshly baked loaf of bread and 2 thick, colorful quilts. She sat with Matilda for an hour, talking about her children and the church social, her cheerful chatter a balm on the raw edges of Matilda's silence. She didn't ask about what had happened. She seemed to understand that the story would come when it was ready. Dr. Finch continued his visits, bringing medical supplies but also news from the small town of Hope's Landing, a few miles down the mountain. He told her about the goings-on, the births, and the squabbles, weaving her into the fabric of the community before she had even set foot in it. A young man named Peter stopped by with a haunch of venison, tipping his hat shyly and refusing to stay for thanks. Each visitor was a thread, stitching her back into the world of human connection. One afternoon, Abram brought out a wooden box filled with packets of seeds. "Sarah's," he said, setting it on the table between them. She always planned her garden in the dead of winter. Said it was an act of faith. He spread the packets out, their colorful illustrations a promise of summer in the middle of the snowbound landscape. Corn, beans, squash, tomatoes. Matilda picked one up, the paper dry and fragile in her hands. She remembered her own garden, the one she had tended for nearly 50 years, its neat rows a source of pride and sustenance. Franklin's wife, Beatrice, had always hated the dirt under her fingernails. She had wanted to pave it over. "It's a good plan," Matilda said, her voice quiet. They spent the rest of the afternoon sorting seeds, planning rows, talking about seasons of planting and harvest. For the first time since the wagon had disappeared down that lonely track, Matilda felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost forever. She was thinking about the future. A future she was choosing to plant. The wagon appeared at the end of the laneway just as the spring thaw was turning the world to mud. Matilda was on the porch, wrapped in one of Helen's quilts, watching Sundance chase a squirrel. She recognized the horse first, then the wagon, then the shape of the man holding the reins. Franklin. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Abram came out of the cabin and stood beside her, a silent, solid presence. He didn't say a word, but his being there was everything. Franklin climbed down from the wagon, his movements stiff. He looked older, thinner. The easy confidence he had worn like a cloak was gone, replaced by a weary uncertainty. He stopped a few feet from the porch, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Ma," he said. His voice was hoarse. He couldn't seem to look at her directly, his eyes scanning the cabin, the woodpile, the man standing beside her. We heard you were here. Someone in town sent word." He paused, as if expecting her to fill the silence. She said nothing. She just waited, her gaze steady. "We were coming back for you," he finally stammered. "We were. But the snow came so fast. The pass was blocked for weeks. We couldn't get through." The lies were so flimsy, so pathetic, she almost felt a pang of pity for him. "Almost. You left me in a canvas tent, Franklin," she said. Her voice was not angry, not loud. It was quiet, level, and devastating in its simplicity. "In November." "The snow always comes in November." He flinched as if she had struck him. "I know." Beatrice was worried. "About the cost of things. We thought you were strong enough." He finally looked at her then, his eyes pleading. "You always were." The self-deception was complete. He had built a story where his cruelty was a testament to her strength. Where his abandonment was a temporary, unforeseen inconvenience. He needed her to believe it, to absolve him. She looked at his face, the face she had once loved more than her own life, and she saw a stranger. A weak man who had traded his mother for a quiet life and a painted room. A man who couldn't even own the truth of what he had done. She thought of the cold, the gnawing hunger, the terror of being buried alive. And she thought of the taste of warm broth, the weight of a quilt, the quiet kindness of a true stranger. The contrast was absolute. "I have a home now," Matilda said, and the words were truer than any she had ever spoken. She looked at Abram, then back at her son. The statement hung in the air between them, irrefutable. It wasn't the cabin, not the physical structure. It was the safety, the belonging she had found within its walls and within the small circle of people who had asked for nothing and given everything. Franklin's face crumpled. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who had scraped his knee, searching for his mother to make it better. But she was no longer that mother. That woman had died in the snow. "Ma, please," he said, taking a step forward. "Come home. We have your room ready. It's all painted." Blue, your favorite color. The detail was meant to be a kindness, a proof of his love, but it was an insult. A coat of paint to cover a chasm of betrayal. He thought he could fix this with paint. My home is here, Franklin. Her voice was gentle, but the finality in it was like stone. This was not a negotiation. It was a fact. Sundance, who had been watching from the edge of the porch, let out a low growl. He had not forgotten. Abram placed a hand on Matilda's shoulder, a small, grounding gesture. He was her family now. The man who had carried her from a tomb, not the boy who had led her to it. The grief was a physical thing inside her, the painful tearing of a bond that had defined her for her entire adult life. It was the final amputation. Forgiving him was one thing, she would have to do that for her own soul to find peace. But trusting him, returning to him, that was impossible. The foundation was gone, washed away by a winter of lies. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching. He had come for absolution, for a return to the way things were, but he found a locked door. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated not her strength for survival, but her capacity for creating a new life without him. Finally, he turned, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He climbed back into the wagon and drove away, not looking back. Matilda watched until he was gone, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. She was free. And she was grieving. The two feelings were tangled together, bittersweet and sharp. The town of Hope's Landing adopted her. It was an unspoken, collective decision. With Abram's help, she took over a small, abandoned cabin at the edge of town, not far from his own. It was little more than a shack, but the community descended on it like a swarm of determined bees. Peter, the young man who had brought the venison, spent a week patching the roof and chinking the logs. Helen organized the women of the church, who arrived with buckets and brushes, scrubbing the small cabin from floor to ceiling and filling its shelves with jars of preserves, flour, and beans. Dr. Finch declared the place fit for human habitation and installed a small, efficient wood stove he'd salvaged. Matilda worked alongside them, her hands growing stronger every day. She swept floors, washed windows, and planted a small kitchen garden in the patch of sun-drenched earth behind the cabin. She pressed corn seeds into the dark, rich soil, feeling the cycle of life begin again under her own care. This garden was hers. No one would pave it over. She found a new rhythm, a new identity. She was no longer just Franklin's mother or Thomas's widow. She was Matilda. The woman who survived. The woman who made the best biscuits in town, according to the pastor. The woman who could sit with a sick child and calm them with her quiet presence. Her relationship with Abram settled into a comfortable, easy companionship. They were not lovers, but something deeper, more resonant. They were fellow survivors who understood the landscape of loss. He would stop by her cabin in the evenings, and they would sit on her small porch, drinking tea and watching the sun set behind the mountains. They didn't need to fill the silence with talk. They had an understanding that ran deeper than words. They had seen the worst of what people could be, and they had chosen to embody the best. Sundance thrived. He was no longer the worried, anxious creature of the woods, but a happy town dog, beloved by the children who saved him scraps and revered by the adults who knew his story. He was a living symbol of loyalty, a stark contrast to the human loyalty that had failed so profoundly. Her life was small, but it was full. It was built not on blood obligation, but on chosen connection. It was a life earned, not given. A year passed. The aspen leaves turned to gold, then fell, carpeting the ground. The air grew crisp with the familiar scent of wood smoke and the sharp promise of snow. Another winter was coming. But this year, there was no fear. Matilda sat on her porch, a thick quilt across her lap, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Her cabin was warm, her pantry was full, and her heart, while still bearing the scars of what was lost, was at peace. Sundance lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes half closed in contentment. He raised his head as Abram walked up the path, carrying 2 mugs of his own. He handed one to her. "Thought you might be getting low," he said. He sat in the chair beside her, a comfortable ritual they had performed 100 times. They watched the last rays of sun paint the peaks of the mountains in shades of rose and orange. "It's beautiful," Matilda said softly. She thought of the tent, of the suffocating darkness and the biting cold. She remembered the feeling of utter abandonment. It felt like another life, a story that had happened to someone else. The cruelty of her children had not destroyed her. It had, in a strange and painful way, liberated her. It had stripped her of everything she thought she was, forcing her to discover who she could become. It had led her here, to this porch, to this friend, to this quiet, profound peace. She had been left for dead, but a community of strangers had insisted she live. They had offered her a place, not out of pity or obligation, but out of a simple, shared humanity. They were the family she had not known she was looking for. "Yes, it is," Abram said, his eyes on the horizon. The silence that fell between them was not empty. It was full of unspoken understanding, of shared history, of the quiet satisfaction of a day's work done and a life rebuilt from the ashes. The first snowflake of the season drifted down, landing on the sleeve of her coat, a perfect, intricate star. She watched it melt without a trace of fear. She was ready. She was home.